Good morning, everyone. Whoa. That's what happens when you set it down on the wrong button. Good morning. So it's good to see everybody this morning. Appreciate you being here. We've got, as we said, some visitors. We're really glad you're here. And our members, your presence is important to us as well. We don't want to discount that ever. We're just really glad that you're here, and that really fits into what we want to say this morning. There is a very prevalent idea in our world today that goes something like this. I don't need the church. I have a personal relationship with God, and that's enough. We hear that a lot. May not be worded exactly like that, but the idea is that I can be pleasing to God without joining myself to a body of believers, without worshiping collectively and being involved in the work at all. Or I can just, I've heard some that say, I can just worship God on my own at home, or while I'm out in nature enjoying myself, or something like this. But at the heart of this idea is that being part of a local church isn't necessary. And more people, I think, are grasping onto this concept and are running with it. Unfortunately, now serving as a shepherd here in Kaysville now for almost 3 years, unfortunately, I've personally heard some things very similar to these ideas. Although it's not always the case, it seems that this comes from people that might be struggling with their faith and who might be struggling spiritually, and they latch on to this idea as an excuse almost for not participating, not coming to services and participating in the work of the local church. And it's a convenient idea. It kind of fits their life better. And deep down, I think that is often the case, is that they just don't have a desire to be involved with the cause of Christ at all. And you might call this kind of person maybe a just enougher, if you will. I've heard Rob say that from time to time. It's somebody who does the minimal things. Somebody that has been baptized and wants the benefits of salvation, but that's it. None of the other stuff that may come with being a Christian, and it saddens me a lot. It saddens me to think about people like this, and it saddens me because I know what they're missing out on, and I know that what the rest of us are missing out on by their lack of participation and involvement. And I think that there's a big misunderstanding of how God feels about this. And unfortunately, this idea is even being taught, it's being promoted, and of course, being accepted and believed by so many people. And I hope to explore this morning what the Bible says about this subject. Not all of it, of course, we don't have time for that, but what does the Bible say about this, so that we can give it some very serious thought and perhaps use it in some discussions that we may have with some other folks as we have opportunity. I believe our audience this morning consists of mostly of people that have proclaimed their allegiance to Jesus for the most part, I believe, and have been baptized for the remission of their sins. And so based on that assumption, I'm going to start with some questions as we begin this morning. I want to ask you, to those folks, why did you decide to become a Christian in the first place? Why did you decide to become a Christian? What were your expectations of becoming a Christian? And maybe you weren't really sure what to expect when you became a Christian, but so maybe the better question might be, well, what do you expect now? Now that you have been a Christian for a while, what are your expectations as a Christian? And what do you expect to gain exactly by entering into this relationship with God? And ultimately, the real question is that I want to ask is, what do you really want by being a Christian? What do you really want? And the reason that I want to start there with these questions, because I think that the way that you answer those, the way you really answer these questions, I think says a lot about you, especially the last one. And so, give that some thought. Of course, your answer might be quite different from when you were a babe in Christ compared to one who's been a Christian for a few years or maybe even decades. Hopefully you decided to be baptized because of your recognition of your sinful condition before God. And you wanted to correct that. You wanted to cleanse yourself of those sins. You wanted to reserve your spot in heaven, in a sense, and live your life with the hope that we have in Jesus. And it may have started with a very simple thought, the very maybe a small thought of just wanting to avoid hell for eternity, and that's part of it as well. But hopefully it wasn't only because of peer pressure or a sense of obligation towards someone like maybe your parents or maybe somebody that you were dating at the time or your friends or something like that. Hopefully it wasn't just something that you were checking off of a list because you knew it was something that you needed to do. And regarding expectations and what you hope to gain in this relationship with God, I hope that they were realistic. I hope that they were pure, that they were not selfishly motivated at all. I hope that there was a sense of humility involved so that the expectation isn't all about what you hope to gain as a recipient only, but also that there was a sense of responsibility and realization that some things were expected of you. I hope that you understood the commitment that is involved and that you weren't approaching this like you were joining some sort of a club or something similar to that. And finally, that last question, what do you really want by being a Christian? I'm going to reserve that for the very end of our lesson this morning. Keep that question in mind as we go through our lesson today. What do I want by being a Christian? As we get started, I think it's important for us to define the word church. In the Bible, we see the word church in many passages, but we need to have a good understanding of what that really means, because I think there is a big misunderstanding what the church is, and it causes some real problems. The original word in the New Testament, where you see it translated as church, was ecclesia. We've said that before, and it simply means an assembly, a congregation, the called out. And what we're talking about is a group of people here. In the context of the Bible passage where it's used, it means a special group of people of God's people. And that's important to keep in mind when we're reading the Bible, because the English word church is derived from a Greek word, kurikon. And I don't know if I'm saying that right or not, Kurikon, right? But that's where the English word is derived from. And the Greek word kurikon actually means a building or a place that belongs to God. And that's much different from the definition of ecclesia. It's much different. Now, I'm certainly no expert at all on this subject, but from what I have read, King James, which that ought to resonate with everybody, if you have a King James version of the Bible, he's the one that sanctioned that. He didn't, from what I understand, what I've read, he didn't like the translation and wanted an English version that could put the king in the place of authority over the church. And so, in essence, he wanted language used that would give the king authority over the ecclesia. But he had to use an English word to fit that agenda. And so instead of translating the original Greek word ecclesia in the Bible as assembly or congregation or the called out, he used the word church. And so now in the American English, the word church has come to mean several different meanings. And one of them, of course, is a building, a place for worship. It also has come to mean a religious service, a worship service, or maybe even an ecclesiastical government of a particular group as opposed to a secular government of a group. And so when you think about all that, you see how all of this has really altered and really confused the biblical meaning of church, or as it was originally written, ecclesia. And let's face it, we're all here this morning and probably guilty of misusing it as well. Even today, probably some of us in the building here today said we're going to church, right? Meaning that we were going to the worship service. Or we're going to the church to work on the classrooms or to whatever the case, meaning the building, right? We've all done that. We've misused that. And so here's the point. If you're a Christian, I want you to hear this. If you're a Christian, the church, you don't go to church. You ready for this? You are the church. You don't go to church. You are the church. And to those that say, I don't need to go to church to be a Christian, we need to understand this very important point and understand that you cannot disassociate from the church as a Christian any more than you can disassociate from humanity as a person. You are the church. You don't go to church. You are the church. And so when we use the word church, we need to make sure that we're using it and thinking of it in the sense that it was originally intended in the Bible. A special group of people that have been called out of the world by the gospel of Christ, a group that belongs to Jesus, that have confessed Him as the true Messiah, the Christ, that have turned away from their sinful life, have been baptized for the remission of their sins, and now have begun a life devoted to Him and His cause. The church is not a building. The church is not a worship service. It's not some sort of hierarchy or government. When you think of the Kaysville Church of Christ, what you need to understand is what we are really saying is this: that it is a group of believers that belong to Christ that happen to meet in Kaysville. That's all it is. It's not some sort of big official name or whatever. That's what it is, and we need to understand that when we're talking about church. And I want to start here this morning, start this discussion, because as I say the word church in the remainder of our lesson this morning, I want you to understand how I'm using it and what I'm actually referring to. And so with that as our foundation this morning, I want to notice some things about the Lord's church. And the first thing is I want you to notice and understand the importance of the church. And the very first thing that I want to say to you is that the church was not plan B. The church was not some sort of alternate plan. It has been God's purpose for eternity. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 4 says that He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. And what that really means is that this called out group of people, this ecclesia, was the plan for eternity. That's all it means. Later on in chapter 3 and verse 10 through 11 in Ephesians, Paul says that the gospel now being available to the Gentiles, bringing light to this mystery, revealing this wisdom of God, might be made known, how? Through the church. And that this was the eternal purpose that He carried out in Jesus. It wasn't a secondary plan, as some falsely claim. Matter of fact, in Matthew 16 and verse 18, Jesus said and told Peter that it was something that He fully intended to build. And it's so important to Him that Jesus was willing to spill His own blood to purchase it, as we see in Acts 20 and Ephesians 5. And this special family, this household of God that we have, all believers of Jesus have the privilege of being a part of, has God as their Father. The church is also referred to as a kingdom, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13. And other places. And we have the privilege of being citizens of this kingdom, and Jesus rules as our King. And as we read Acts chapter 2 and verse 47, we see that the ones that obey through faith and baptism are added to the church. To what? To the ecclesia, this body of believers in essence, becoming members of this church. And so when we obey, we are now identified as a member of the Lord's church because God adds you there. And so for those who are of the belief that the church was some sort of an alternate plan and discount the importance of the church, I'd suggest to you that you pay close attention to the New Testament. Because you'll notice there that the New Testament really, a good portion of it, does not consist of the teachings of Jesus, but really of the work of the church that Jesus built. You would have to eliminate a significant portion of the New Testament to argue that the church is not important. And so being a member of His church is important because it places us in a restored relationship with God. It's restored because it was once severed by our sin. It was our fault. And the church was purposed and planned by God. It was built by Jesus. It was purchased by His blood. It is the family of God, the body and the kingdom of Christ. The ecclesia, the church, first of all, is important because of the ties that it has to God. And a failure to appreciate that is really a rejection of God and His will. But we should also point out quickly that the church is used in two very distinct ways in the New Testament. One of those is in a very general or a universal sense, referring to all people who belong to and enjoy fellowship with Christ. Matthew 16, verse 18, again, a passage we referred to a minute ago, where Jesus told Peter that upon this great confession, upon this statement of faith that Peter made there, that Jesus was going to build His church. He was going to create the ecclesia that is founded upon this foundational statement that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, the Christ. Colossians 1 and verse 18 tells us that Jesus is the head of this body, the church, the body of believers, these called out people. And Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 4 tells us that there's how many bodies? One. There is one body. There's one church. And when it is used in this sense, you see, every faithful member of this body, of this one church, this one body we're talking about, saved individuals are added to the one church. And so it's used in a universal sense. But it also can be used in a very specific local sense, referring to members of the one church that are in a specific location, just like we said a second ago with Kaysville, a group of believers that happen to meet in Kaysville. Acts chapter 5 verse 11 talks about the great fear that came over the church there in Jerusalem after Ananias and Sapphira were killed for their dishonesty. Acts chapter 14 and verse 23 says that they appointed elders in every church, in every local body of believers. 1 Corinthians 1 addresses the church at Corinth. Revelation 1 through 3, I think it is. The 7 different churches in Asia are addressed. And so it's being used in a very local, specific sense, and there's no contradiction there with what we said a second ago with Ephesians 4 and one church. And so it can be used in two different ways. So I would like you to notice with me, for the next few minutes, what the local church did in the New Testament. Because I think that we'll clearly see what God's intention is and the purpose of the church. And I hope that you'll begin to see how this addresses this prevalent concept that I presented in the beginning and what I believe is the false idea of, I don't need the church to be a Christian. I think we've already put a major dent in this idea, but stay with me here for a minute if you will. First, I suppose that we should ask and answer the question of whether or not membership in a local church is necessary. The question is there precedence in the Bible of individuals joining a work or making some sort of a commitment to a local work? And I would propose to you that there is. So we've already noted, Paul wrote letters to a number of local churches, and he addressed them in a certain way. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 2, and also verse 10, we see that he addressed the church in Corinth, and he also called them saints and brethren. 1 Thessalonians is similar. He wrote to the church of the Thessalonians there, and he addressed them as beloved brethren. And so to address the local church is to address the saints in that area. And the conclusion is that all faithful disciples should be identified or recognized as part of a local church. Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, again, addresses all of the saints in Philippi. And then in chapter 4, verse 15, he says, "No church shared with me, but you only." We also see in Acts chapter 13 and verse 1 that Paul and Barnabas and other teachers were in the church that was at Antioch. At this point in time, they weren't identified with any other church of Jerusalem or Samaria or whatever the case might be. It says that they were in the church in Antioch at that point in time. And then a strange passage is in 3 John 10, where we often go for another reason. We talk about Diotrephes, but here he was, and it says there that he was putting people out of the church. And so the implication is that some people were previously recognized as being in the church. It just seems to me that these passages, along with others, imply a membership, if you will, of a specific local group of Christians. But stay with me as we consider some other things, because I think some other things that we have to say will help with this idea, talking about identifying with a certain group and committing to that particular work. And one of them is God's plan and organization for leadership of the local church. Acts chapter 14, as we mentioned a minute ago, verse 23, talks about how they appointed elders in every church. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul begins his letter by saying he wanted Titus to set in order by appointing elders in every city. And the implication being that church without elders is out of order. It's not organized the way that it should be. I think maybe a better way of saying that is that it's not in its optimal operating condition without an eldership. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17 then talks about submitting to these leaders. In 1 Thessalonians 5, that you should appreciate those who labor among you and have charge over you. And then when you go to 1 Peter chapter 5 and you look at the first 3 verses there, we see where the jurisdiction of that eldership is laid out. We understand that it's limited to the flock that is among you. And so, even when you think about eldership from the standpoint of the qualifications that are laid out, I want you to think about it this way. When you think about all of those qualifications that we have in 2 different passages, you have to ask the question, well, who decides this? As you're evaluating men and considering men and looking at these qualifications, who decides that? Who reviews these men and to determine if they really meet these qualifications? It has to be the members of that local congregation that know these men the best. And then you have, once a decision is made to appoint a man as an elder, then really what you have is an agreement that has taken place with the elder and the congregation there. The elder agrees to lead, and the congregation is agreeing to follow and submit to their leadership. So elders are for a very specific, very defined group of people in a certain place. And that defined group of people submit to that leadership. And so it seems pretty clear to me that some sort of membership is implied. There needs to be some sort of definition there. And I would say it to you this way, that a shepherd, as we see on the picture here on the screen, that a shepherd needs to know who the flock is that they're shepherding. Is that a fair way of putting it? And so it begs the question that if Christ didn't intend for His people to be a close bonded family, then why did He organize the local body this way? It's a beautiful design. It provides accountability and organization that we all so desperately need. And so we start bringing this into focus more and more and see that membership, if you will, of a local body of believers is God's intention. But notice some other things with me. The early church was heavily involved in evangelism. These local groups of believers were working together in this effort. But it wasn't just evangelism in the sense of seeking the lost only. It was more than that. In Acts chapter 13, the first 3 verses, we have the example of the church in Antioch sending Barnabas and Saul out into the mission field Philippians 1 and also in chapter 4, Paul mentions their participation in the preaching of the gospel. And so it's the church, it is the group of believers that are involved in evangelism by contributing financially and praying for and encouraging those who are doing the preaching and other ways as well. But we also see and understand that it is the responsibility of the church to promote and to preserve the truth. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, it says that one of the main purposes of the church is to be a pillar and support of the truth. It is to be the foundation of the truth so that God is glorified, so that the lost hear the gospel, that the believers are spiritually nourished and fed. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11 through 16 talks about the various roles that we all have, including some being teachers. And the result is what? The result is that all of the saints are equipped and built up and fed so that they become mature and strong and steadfast in their faith. But the ecclesia and the called out, the church, is also a place of edification and encouragement. Again, referring to Ephesians 4, we have to understand that in order to achieve this growth and this building up of the body, that it requires encouragement. And friends, let me just say that you can't do that if you're off on an island by yourself, if you remember the first slide that was up. You just can't do that. You can't do that if you're not fully engaged with your brethren. You can't do that if you're not assembling with the saints. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24 urges us to consider how that we can stimulate each other. How that we can stimulate each other and encourage each other to love and to good deeds. And Paul told the Thessalonian church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 to encourage and to build one another up. And I'm saying to you this morning that the church is where that happens. The church being a close, tight-knit group of people, that's where all of this happens. That's where talents and abilities are developed and used for the glory of God. It's a responsibility of the individual believers that have banded together and committed to work together in the cause of Christ to edify each other, which again cannot be done if you are not an active member of the ecclesia, the church. But even when you consider this idea of benevolence and caring for the needy saints, this is a little quick point. You know, we're going to here in just a few moments, to take up a weekly collection as we read about in the New Testament. So that why do we do that? Well, one of the reasons is so that we are prepared and we have the ability to address the needs that may come up. And so look at it this way, that if no individual members are participating in this, then guess what? There is no treasury. And if there is no treasury, then no needs can be met. It's pretty simple. Collectively as a church, as a congregation, we can do some really good things together. And let me just say this, that here in Kaysville, we have. We've done some pretty nice things. We've had the ability, we've been blessed to be able to do that, and we're to be commended, you're to be commended for that. But I also want you to notice this. It's the last point I want to mention about the church this morning. That they assembled together. And they did it continually, for the purpose of collective worship and, hear this, for simply spending time together because of their common faith. Acts chapter 2 and verse 42 says that they continually devoted themselves to teaching and fellowship and breaking bread and prayer. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 through 12, it says that they gathered on the first day of the week for the purpose of partaking of the Lord's Supper with other Christians. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we just talked about that a minute ago, Steve. that they came together as a church, as an ecclesia, as a local group of fellow believers in order to do this. Saul and Barnabas assembled with the church in Antioch in Acts chapter 11, as we talked about a minute ago. And so if you read the New Testament, you simply cannot deny that it is not only a command to assemble, that there's examples of the church assembling together on a regular basis, but also we need to see the benefit to assembling, the benefit to collectively worshiping together and spending time together. And that is, as we pray together, as we sing together, as we commune, as we did just a moment ago in the Lord's Supper, as we study together and we're nourished by His Word, you know what happens? We draw strength from each other. We are encouraged. And in a sense, we are emboldened to be a warrior for Jesus because we're reminded that we're not alone. When we assemble together, we are reminded, or we have the opportunity to deepen our relationships that allow us to call on each other and to serve each other when needed, and to create some accountability with each other so that we can help each other on this journey of life and stay on track to defeat the attacks of Satan. That's the beauty of it. That's the benefit of it. It is intended to be a group of believers that admonishes one another out of love for each other and the desire to help each other get to heaven, and is receptive to receiving admonishment. The idea is that we teach and encourage each other in order to prevent sinful actions. And when you look at the early church in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, you see how involved they were with each other, even outside of assembling for worship. It wasn't just that. And they're promoting love and unity and fellowship. They were truly a family. Friends, I'm suggesting that we need to be so involved in each other's lives so that we can assist one another in growing our faith and steering clear of sin. It is a beautiful thing. And if you aren't doing that on a regular basis, boy, you sure are missing out on a wonderful gift from God. Church should not be looked at as a burden. It should be viewed as a tremendous blessing. And it also brings us to a tough question. And I hope that you will hear this out in the spirit that is intended. And the tough question is, if it is acceptable for one member not to assemble, and not to contribute, and not to sing, and not to do all of these things, then what that means is that it is acceptable for all members not to do those things. And if all chose not to do those things, what would happen? What would happen? Hopefully you see the importance of doing these things together. We all will individually, obviously, give an account to God for how we live our lives. I understand that. But being a Christian is not a private affair. We need each other. And that is what the church is all about. That's what the ecclesia is all about. Being a Christian was never, ever intended to be something that you just did on your own. The intention is that you were a member of a family. There's so much more that we can say on this subject, but I'll stop there for now. But I want to go back to the question that we asked in the very beginning, and that is, what do you want as a Christian? if you desire fellowship and love, if you desire to have a special relationship with other believers, if you desire encouragement and strength that is so desperately needed in this dark world, if in your heart you desire to be fed, to receive nourishment, you're looking for growth and you're looking to mature and to increase in wisdom, if you in your heart really are looking for accountability, if you are open to having others help you to stay on track, and are open to others correcting you in love when you need it, if you in your heart have a desire and understand the benefit of discipline, because you know, even though it may not be pleasant, even though it might be painful at times, deep down you know the benefit of that, and that is meaningful. If you desire, if you want as a Christian to be a part of evangelistic efforts, because you deeply appreciate the gospel of Jesus Christ and what this means to you, and in turn, you want to share that with others. If these are the things that you desire, if you want these in your heart, friend, then hear me out. That's what being a member of the local body of Christians is all about. That is what the intention and the purpose of the ecclesia is. That's what the Bible teaches. If you don't desire these things, then I can understand why you might say that you don't need the church. But I would also say that I would strongly suggest that you do some serious self-evaluation and that you make some changes in your heart, because this is God's design. This is His intention. This is how He wanted it. This is why Jesus died for you. If you don't want these things, I pray that your heart will be softened and that you will eventually accept God's design. And I pray that you will plug in, that you will be engaged more so than maybe you have in the past, that you will be fully involved with your brethren, and that we will all work together in the cause of Christ. If you're here this morning, you need to make some corrections to your relationship with God. We're going to have this opportunity as we stand up and sing. Just make your wishes known as we sing.